Hi, everyone. Great to be here. How's everyone handling the heat? All good? We're ready? Perfect. My name is Alon. I'm the CEO of SSV.Labs, which is the core team behind SSV.Network. We develop decentralized infrastructure for Ethereum, and we're doing a bunch of different things, but our main focus is really on the validator level. SSV is a distributed validator network for Ethereum. We currently have around 120,000 validators on Ethereum. It's 11% of Ethereum. Roughly 1 out of 10 validators is an SSV validator, second largest protocol out there with 1,700, more than 1,700 mainnet operators. We are very focused on making Ethereum more robust, more resilient, more censorship resistant, and bettering Ethereum as we go along. And that was kind of our mission, is still very much is our mission. And I've been in the space for quite a while. I've been since 2012. And I think at this point, we can all agree that Ethereum definitely has the tech supremacy in the kind of the blockchain world, right? It's definitely leading up with the rollup centric roadmap. Even though some think it might not be the right choice, I think that at this point it proves to be not only just a scalable solution, but also a real world business model for a lot of different rollups. We saw or will see a big announcement coming up from Robinhood and others. And so the rollup centric roadmap is very much an interesting approach and leads the tech in the blockchain space. Obviously, getting a lot of developers. Many of the dApps start on Ethereum, and of course, stablecoins, real-world assets, the works, right? Everything is very much Ethereum-centric when it comes to innovation and comes to new applications. And the rollup-centric roadmap really served us very well going forward. But it also created some challenges. Fragmentation, for example, and value capturing are two of the biggest challenges rollups present today. Fragmentation is really pretty much having each rollup kind of its own economic zone, if you think about it. The rollup itself and the developers on it are kind of an island in a sea of Ethereum. And that creates a lot of challenges for dApps and users, bridging in between and the composability aspect of all of the different rollups. But it also creates a value capturing problem, because as more transactions happen on L2s or on rollups, we're seeing less and less of that value coming back to Ethereum. And I think it's as prominent as possible with really the kind of the divergence we're seeing between Ethereum, the blockchain, and Ethereum, the token. Ethereum, the blockchain, is doing amazing. More transactions than ever, the hub of innovation. But Ethereum, the token, is not doing that great. This is a graph showing ETH versus Bitcoin the last, I think, 2 years. And there's a divergence between the two, right? How can it happen? How can it be that Ethereum, the blockchain, is doing so well, but Ethereum, the token, is not doing so much? And I think it's due to a lot of different reasons, but this divergence is quite critical. It's quite dangerous to Ethereum, because I don't think the blockchain can survive without the token, and vice versa. And so we're at this point where we need to find ideas and solutions to the fragmentation value capturing problem, because otherwise it does endanger, I think, Ethereum as a whole. And there's a very simple question we need to answer. Why would the average Joe hold ETH in their wallet? And the answer is not gas, because you don't really need that much of a gas in order to transact and do things on Ethereum. This simple question is a major one. It's probably the most pivotal point in Ethereum's future and current state of affairs. But it wasn't always the case, because if you go back to 2017, there was a really good reason to hold ETH. Back in the ICO crazy age, there was a really good reason to hold ETH, which was to buy into ICOs. You used ETH in order to participate in other ICOs. That was a really good reason to hold ETH. Fast forward a few years, and with the DeFi summer of 2022, there was yet another really good reason to hold ETH, which was to provide liquidity into DeFi protocols and trade with other assets. That was a really good reason to hold ETH. What will be the next reason? What will be the next wave of reasons for the average Joe, TradFi, Wall Street, just anyone who wants to get into crypto to hold ETH? And I think the answer to that is establishing Ethereum, the token, as this security layer, not just for Ethereum itself, but this whole ecosystem, namely talking about rollups. And I think the solution there, or the enabler to that, are based on composable rollups. We talked about it with the Nethermind presentation just a few minutes ago, but I want to go deeper. I want to kind of talk about what are the steps, what are the features, what are the components that will enable us to solve two problems which are major for Ethereum. One is the fragmentation problem for rollups, and the other one is value capturing. So let's dive in. Based on composable rollups do a few things. One, they are based, meaning that they are sequenced, or the transaction building process happens not by a centralized sequencer, but rather by L1 validators in a distributed and decentralized way. Basically reusing this incredibly powerful validator set of Ethereum as a credibly neutral sequencing layer for Ethereum itself. The second part of it is composability, the idea that we can do cross-transactions between rollups and also between Ethereum and those rollups in a seamless way. So base rollups are the idea that we replace or change the way the sequencer works. Current rollups rely mostly on centralized sequencers. That is, there's a server somewhere that decides arbitrarily which transactions go in and which transactions don't, right? If you're on the base rollup, Coinbase is deciding that. If you're on the Unichain rollup, then Uniswap is deciding that. But it's not decentralized in any way. It's very much centralized and therefore not exactly aligned with what Ethereum ethos is. Censorship resistance, decentralization, and the idea of credible neutrality. And so base rollups really change that. They give that power of sequencing back to L1 validators. L1 validators all of a sudden do much more than just secure Ethereum. They actually sequence the rollups themselves. The side effect of that is that L1 validators all of a sudden receive fees from that sequencing action, and those fees go directly to ETH holders. In other words, we can capture more value from rollups back to ETH holders by unlocking this base rollup scheme. And not only that, we also make rollups better because the sequencing is done in a centralized and censorship-resistant way, and it's much more aligned to the ethos of Ethereum itself. And so that's what base rollups are. They're solving some of the challenges of rollups, but also creating more value capture back to ETH itself. Pre-confirmations are a very interesting side effect of using base rollups. Base rollups can actually provide, even before the transaction hits the block, can provide a pre-confirmation that the transaction will be in that block. Basically 100 millisecond or even sub 100 millisecond transaction confirmation. So from a user point of view, imagine you're hitting this send button on MetaMask or your favorite wallet. Within 100 milliseconds, you can be crypto-economically sure that the transaction is included in the next block. So think of the user experience going from that, right? The closest we have right now is Solana boosting 250, 400 millisecond blocks. That's the best we have right now. Here we have 25% of that, even lower. And so that's a major boost in user experience. And so it's very much connected to the whole rollup-centric roadmap where most of the transactions will go into rollups and not Ethereum, the L1. And that's an interesting side effect of using Ethereum validators as sequencers. But the really big feature is composability. Composability is the idea that we can transact between rollups and between Ethereum and those rollups in a seamless way. In a seamless way means that it's like the user experience you're having right now on Ethereum. One transaction can interact with multiple rollups and do things. So for example, you can take your assets in the L1, deposit them into your favorite L2, trade, and get those assets back all in one transaction. One synchronous transaction. No delays, no multi-hops and multi-blocks and stuff like that. Seamless user experience. I think the biggest outcome of that is that finally we can actually give the power to smaller rollups to actually spin off and become successful, and not just huge brand names like Coinbase and Robinhood basically being the most successful rollups out there. We can actually enable, with composability, having much more rollups, much smaller rollups play together and creating this network of rollups that can actually compete with the big boys, with the brand name rollups. And that's extremely important for Ethereum, because ultimately we need to remember that Ethereum is all about the dApps it has. It's not about Coinbase or Robinhood. Coinbase and Robinhood are services. They're amazing at what they're doing, but it's not Ethereum. Ethereum is the developers building smart contracts. And so by enabling those smart contract developers to evolve with the times, to actually spin up, if they're big enough and successful enough to spin up their own rollups, control the user experience, get additional rewards obviously out of those rollups, but still be competitive because of composability, that's a game changer. We can have much more rollups, we can have much more traffic on rollups, but more importantly, we can have much more decentralized and diverse set of rollups, and that's ultimately what it's all about. We don't want all of Ethereum interactions happening through centrally sequenced rollups. And that's where composability comes in. Composability can solve the biggest issue those smaller rollups have, which is fragmentation. If I'm a small rollup, it's very hard to bootstrap and very hard to compete. But if a bunch of small rollups come together and the user experience is completely seamless, that's an amazing opportunity to bring all of those rollups in. And composability unlocks that. Now, if you add another layer to it, L1 to L2 composability, all of a sudden, Ethereum and the rollups become one big chain. There's no difference. Technically, there are differences. A rollup is its own chain, Ethereum is its own chain. But from the user experience, there is no difference. The interaction is completely seamless. And composability enables that. And that, after all, if you think really deeply about the promise of rollups. The promise of rollups wasn't just about scale, because there's a bunch of ways to scale. The promise of rollups was always that you can scale without compromising on the ethos and the properties of Ethereum. And I think with composability, we can do that. We can scale horizontally, but without compromising on the very core of what we believe in. And composability enables us that. This is extremely Ethereum aligned, and I think it's an important point to mention. Ethereum scales in various ways, right? Robinhood, Coinbase, that's definitely big pillars of how Ethereum scales. But ultimately, Ethereum needs to scale with the promise of its original intent, which was censorship resistance, decentralization, and credibly neutral infrastructure. This is so important because without those elements, there is no Ethereum and there is no blockchain. And being Ethereum aligned is super critical. And in order to become Ethereum aligned and make Ethereum sustainable long term, we have to maintain the value capturing mechanism between Ethereum and all of its ecosystem. We cannot have a divergence between the blockchain and the token. If those two diverge and become distant enough, that's a real danger through Ethereum. And I believe with composability and based sequencing, we can actually solve both of those problems, both the problem of fragmentation and also the problem of value capturing. And SSV plays a major role in that. SSV has a very large validator set, and everything I've just presented here is very much driven by validators. And so we've committed ourselves to not only be active in helping various teams in building, but actually integrating with the various standards coming along and enabling those smaller teams to bootstrap, testnet, and then go into mainnet with a vast array of validators with the biggest names in the industry. And I think that's extremely important for the future of Ethereum. And so if there's anyone in the room today that has anything to do with base rollups in general, sequencing and preconfs, would love to have you guys join, reach out, and we promise to help out as much as we can. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Questions, anyone? All right, thank you so much.